federal, because inherently municipal affects your life the most, then provincial, then federal. You know what I mean? Like our foreign policies are not impacting our lives as much as our healthcare policies, which are provincial. And our healthcare policies are not impacting our life as much as the snow clearing programs, which is municipal. So
but as of right now, I feel like it's when I was in Canada and I have an understanding America had adopted citywide composting. I don't know, but I didn't understand it. They kind of just got on that allocation.
How you doing?
good. How are you guys?
Not bad
Doing
at
very
all.
well. Doing very well. Thanks
Yeah.
for
Good
coming
to
on.
be here.
No, appreciate it. Yeah, and hope you're enjoying the tea so far.
It is. It's a little hot, but that's all good. It's very good. Tastes very good and smells very nice.
Yeah, yo, shout out to Kayo-Tea, our sponsor, right off the bat, just to kind of get things going. We're drinking the lemon verbena today, and we have our good friend Myriam here to just have a little chat with us. And yeah, I guess we'll start right off with you've done like a lot of traveling in your life.
I sure have.
Is there anything, maybe like, would you say like particular story or something, or anything that like defining moments that you stand out in your mind?
That's always a fun little question. It depends, because I feel like I like to break down, like, for me, there's like a travel category and then there's like a lived in category. Because my mom was a diplomat growing up, a Canadian
no way.
diplomat. Yeah.
Really?
And then my dad worked for the UN. So lots of traveling.
Wow.
So I lived in Canada, Haiti, Canada, Ethiopia, Djibouti and Somalia, Canada, Egypt, and then outside of my family, the UK and Spain, and then back to Canada. So those countries to me fall in a different category than like the traveling, because we
Yeah,
did
of
lots of
course.
traveling. I think also the moment you're like in Europe or in Africa, it's a lot easier and cheaper to travel to other places. So we used to do like pretty much every school trip, we'd like go somewhere else. And I'm super lucky because my very white mom was super, super adventurous and like took us to places that chances are nowadays I wouldn't have the opportunity to go to. So like we went to Syria, we went to Iran, we went to Yemen, and I'm like, how did you do that as a single mom? I'm not 100% sure with 2 young kids, but super cool experiences. But those to me fall in a different category than like, the places I've lived in, because we lived there for typically 3 years. So those are a little different. So it's always hard to pinpoint like, what's your favorite memory, or like, what's your favorite country? I'm like, well, it depends. It depends. Like, what are you asking? Is it to
Very
live
true.
there, or is it to like, visit? Because
Just
those are
visit,
very
yeah.
different things, right?
And I like that you differentiate, actually, just because of the fact that it is two very different perspectives. Like staying in a place long enough, you start to learn the culture, you start to learn the familiar areas. Like, what would you say is like maybe a big difference between the two that really stands out to you, between living somewhere like full time or just visiting? Like,
Well, I think firstly, I'll be honest, I think I have a really different perspective to traveling than most people, solely because I've lived in a lot of places. So I'm very much not a big resort person. It makes me feel like a cattle, you know what I mean? Because they're
always
like,
been that
okay,
way
we're
too.
gonna like shepherd you this way, and I'm like,
Yeah.
I am my own person. Thank you. I could figure stuff out. So typically, like how I like to travel is influenced by the fact that I've lived in a lot of countries. So I like to, have like a basic understanding of the language. I like to not make it super obvious that I'm a tourist. I think being mixed also super helps because it makes me really ethnically ambiguous. So people will just be like, like anytime I've gone to Latin America or, any Hispanic countries and I speak Spanish, so people are just like, eres mexicana. And I'm like, sure.
Yeah, that's
yeah, I totally
Yeah,
am.
it must be easier to like kind of navigate, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of cool because like you can kind of have this like this more genuine kind of experience in a country that doesn't feel like an experience catered to a tourist.
fair, like more of the welcoming, homey experience. Like if you're going to
Correct.
someone's like house and they're inviting you for dinner, sort of thing. Like, but out and about. Like,
Correct. And like same with like typically I like to do like Airbnbs or like, like a hostel because, you're in neighborhoods that people actually live in, and
Yeah.
not these like places that are like very, very made for tourists.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're experiencing like the heart of the actual country when you go that route.
That's right. That's
were you how old were you when you were living in all these countries were you like during you growing up?
Correct. So
Okay.
the last one that we lived in where I was a kid, I guess, from the age of 14 to 17, I was in Cairo in Egypt. And that's where I graduated high school, which is pretty cool. And it's a factor that I like to rub in my brother's face because he, by the time he graduated high school, we were back in Canada. So he graduated high school in the gym in Ottawa. And my graduation was in front of the pyramids. So, like to this day, I'm still like, ooh, look at this. Look at my graduation
Such a
pictures.
nice flex,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's like, those like sibling rivalries that never go away. I'm like, sucker.
Did you ever feel like it was a bit like a bit of a displacement kind of growing up, changing schools all the time? Like how that must have been pretty interesting.
For sure. It's hard to always be the new kid. But at the same time, I think it taught me to be like, I think it helps that I was already really extroverted, but it made me very like good at talking to new people and meeting new people and making connections really quickly with people. Learning how to keep in touch, because honestly, nowadays, so many people are really, really bad at communicating and at keeping in touch with people, particularly if they're not like in your direct circle all the time.
For sure.
Your friend moves to a different city and you're like, wow, we never keep in touch. And I'm like, that's my entire childhood. I had an email address at like 7 years old, Wow. But there's also a downside to that in the way that it was a hard way to grow up because, especially when I moved back to Canada, and I went to university and there were all these people around me who were like, oh, this is my friend. We've been friends for 15 years. And I'm like, I don't have those because we moved, right? Same with like activities, I feel like I like to joke that I'm a fraud in many things in life. I'm not a master in anything. I'm just a fraud in a lot of things. 'Cause I'm like, I have a lot of like little knowledge about lots of different things, but that inherently comes from how I grew up because, sure, I got super into skating for the 3 years that we lived in Canada, and then we moved to Egypt. And it's like, where are you going to go skate?
Exactly.
So
complete switch of perspective. Basically.
Absolutely. So it's hard to like maintain any. It's a little bit of an unstable life, let's say. But personally, I think I've seen the positives in it and been like, oh, like this made me grow and be very open-minded as a person. So I'm very thankful for the way that I grew up. If I have kids, would I do it? Probably, because I really enjoyed growing up that way. And I think like sometimes it makes me feel a little disconnected with my peers who grew up here because I'm like, sometimes you kind of sound like you're bragging when you're like, oh yeah, that one time we went on a school trip, to like Indonesia, and people are like, wow, what a dick. Like, you're just bragging. And I'm like, no, but that was just my regular life. There was like nothing really special about it. It's just, that's how I grew up.
And you have to appreciate it if it's happening.
Exactly. So, and I think it made me very aware of like political things around the world and like different cultures. And sometimes it's kind of hard to explain that to people who've never left Canada or who have left Canada, but, gone on like resort vacations and like I know I sound like I'm shitting on resort vacations. I'm not. There's something for everyone, but it's just a very, very different way to experience the world, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
To getting secluded on, being secluded on like a resort is a thing. Like people just like go there and then they're just there, but like there's so much more of a country to actually go and see.
Absolutely.
You know what
and
I
it
mean?
makes it that, if you go to a resort in Cuba and you go to a resort in the Dominican Republic, like you kind of have a very similar experience, even though inherently Cuba and the Dominican Republic are like really, really different places. But you're in this like little bubble where, it's like, oh, there was people spoke Spanish and, there was a beach and this resort looks just like that other resort, but you don't see the cultural differences because you're in this like little insulated.
It's made to
place,
integrate
right?
you a little more like gently. Like if you're
Correct.
a tourist, it's like saying like, oh, you can feel comforted here and like a little bit like it's your home.
Correct.
But you're just in a different place as opposed to actually immersing yourself.
Yeah, it definitely is meant to like standardize the experience, right? So like it's a comfortable space, and it's a comfortable space that you can rely will always be comfortable no matter where you go around the world, which is good. Like people do like stability, and I get that, but at the same time it kind of removes all the like cultural beauties that you could have experienced by going to that place,
And you said you lived in Haiti? Mm-hmm. That's crazy. What year? It's been a while back.
It was a long time ago. I was 3 to 5, so 90.
Okay, 3 to 5. Like you're like 5 years old.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. Because
so like my very first memories are in
Haiti now is pretty intense. It's very notorious of
Correct.
what's going on right now.
Correct, which is really sad because it means like I can't go back and visit, and it does hold like a really special place in my heart because it is the very first place where I really, really had memories. And then my dad passed away not long after we moved back from Haiti. So like a lot of my memories with my dad are in Haiti. So it's like really special place for me. So hopefully one day I'll be able to make it back. But yes, politically it's a little bit in turmoil right now, for sure.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Yeah. There's a YouTube guy. His name's Indigo Traveler. It's pretty interesting. That's crazy. So then what made you decide to like go and travel? Like it was just because of that, like growing up traveling a lot, you decided to go and travel again, I guess?
Yes, absolutely. It just became kind of like a standard in my life that, this like little bit of like wanderlust, which as I found out is not just from my mom. My grandma was the same, and like in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s, she was single and she like went to China and, lots of places that like a woman alone in the 50s and 60s might not have gone to. So it's kind of nice because I'm like, oh, it's genetic. Like it's been passed
pushing
down.
The boundaries a little bit too. Yeah,
absolutely.
That's great.
So I think I wanted to continue that, and like I really loved being in Canada, and I think there was, I think I hit a point at a certain age where I was like, oh, hey, I've lived my entire life with like very little stability, which not hating on that. Like I enjoyed growing up that way, but eventually you start craving a little bit of stability. So I wanted to stay in Canada and still have that stability, but I didn't want to lose that like wanderlust or that like spontaneous, I'm just going to pick up and go somewhere. And I worked as a flight attendant for a couple of years. And when I did that, I got super, super great deals.
Oh yeah,
I paid just taxes.
Yeah.
That's
I went
crazy.
to Australia for $200.
Oh.
Round trip. I was in a middle seat for
crazy.
like 16 hours, which was not ideal because you get whatever seats are left on the plane.
Yeah.
And you don't know if you're going to get on the plane. And you get paid like garbage. So I went to Australia, but couldn't afford to stay anywhere. So I camped my way through Australia for 10 days.
No way.
Yeah, because camping in their provincial provincial parks, I think, is free.
That's crazy.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's $25 for 3 days to park your car, but there's no fee for actually camping. So I went with some of my friends and we just like camped our way
Did you
through.
just have your kind of tent on your back or something?
And
Nice.
when you travel on standby, you don't check bags because you don't know if you're going to make it on the plane because you might get to the plane and they're like,
Yeah,
oh,
standby,
sorry, you can't get, you can't get on. So you wouldn't check your bags because you don't want your bags to end up somewhere you don't end up. So I never ever checked bags, which is really helpful nowadays when like everybody's losing their bags. I'm like, you don't know how to travel with just carry-ons. I'm like, I can pack a mean carry-on. I would
I did
have
the same, just
right?
backpack on board.
Like
yeah.
I would have my backpack and at the
Stuffed
bottom
up.
just like strap my my sleeping bag at the bottom of it, and then my second carry-on was just my tent. And that's just that's just how I did it.
Amazing.
And, my tent has been many places. It's been on many adventures.
That sounds awesome. Though.
Yeah.
Oh my
How
God.
many countries in all have you been to
To
visit?
be honest, I haven't counted in a while. I think the last time I counted, I was at 50.
50?
Wow.
50?
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
That's amazing.
That's crazy. That's
I will
that's
say,
nice.
honestly, though, a lot of it was like with my mom and my brother and,
Yeah, of course.
family trips and stuff. But it was really helpful that like pretty much every family vacation, my mom was like, all right, we're going here. And as a kid, I didn't understand how great that was because, I'm like 8 and I'm like, all of my friends are going to Disney World and I want to go to Disney World.
Yeah, you don't see the
And
value
my
in it when
mom's
you're a
like,
child.
we're going to Ghana. And I was like, why? Like, I just want to go to Disney. It's fine. I took myself to Disney at 21 years old, and it was great.
There's the reward, yeah.
It was great. I went for my birthday. They gave me like a little tiara. They gave me a little button, characters saying happy birthday to me. I was like, I'm a child again. It was great.
That's great.
And I made it happen for myself, which I think is more rewarding.
Yeah. It's kind of like you lived out that dream of yours, but you're like, I fucking hustled for that.
Exactly. I'm like, and there is a lot of reward in being like I wanted this, I made it happen for myself. I didn't wait for anybody else to give it to me, you know?
Going back into geopolitics and like what you were mentioning, I guess you kind of had a bit of a foundation. You like I'd asked you earlier. I don't know if you're like if it's something that you can talk about. You don't have to go necessarily in detail, but you did do like you were like involved in politics, and what made you go that route?
I also realized I'm wearing like a shirt from that party, so I was like, oh, how did that happen?
Sweet.
A little bit of an accident.
Subtle representation.
It was just subtle. Honestly, I've always cared a lot about politics. When we were kids, honestly, I can remember probably from like the age of like 5 or 6. My family just watched the news a lot, and like, you know, we'd watch cartoons in the morning, and then the evenings was like the news. And it's like, if you want to watch, you know, if you want to watch television, then you sit down and you watch it with us, you know? So, and we watched a lot of like Al Jazeera, we watched a lot of BBC, we watch a lot of international news. And to be fair, I feel like I wasn't super clued into Canadian politics for a long time. Yeah, it's the day I turned 18, I woke up that morning and the very first thing I thought was like, oh my God, I can vote. So it's always been something that's been ingrained in me. I've participated in a lot of like, you know, I've volunteered a lot on campaigns and been excited about campaigns. I very much cried, like crying when I found out that Jack Layton died. Yeah, it was in an internet cafe in Madrid. And people came up and they were like, why are you crying? And I was like, this guy died. And they were like, is this your family member? And I'm like, I don't know how to explain to you that like my political idol just died. And like, that sounds really unreasonable that I'm crying about it. So yeah, it's something I've always been like really passionate about. And it was a little bit of a fluke that I ran in politics. It was, I got a phone call asking to renew my membership so that I could vote I could vote in a nomination meeting to select the candidate that would be for the NDP. While I was on the phone, I was like, yeah, absolutely, I'll renew my membership, but also like, what does it take to be a candidate? Just out of curiosity. And then they were like, oh, this is what you do. And, you know, you do this paperwork. And I sent it in, and I honestly didn't think a whole lot about it. But then the more and more I got into it and I started filling out the paperwork and I talked to people and, you know, they were like, why do you want to go into politics? And I think, to me, I think it was really important to have regular people in politics because I think, you know, we have this idea of politicians as like these, you know, like elite or like very like fancy people. And inherently the job of a politician, well, or an MP or an MPP is inherently to represent, like you're elected to represent the people who voted for you, right? So if you're 6 tax brackets above them, or above like the median income in your riding, how can you relate to the people who you're representing? How can you be their voice? And at the time I was like, I have this like really shitty job and I work, you know, I get paid minimum wage and I have a buttload of student debt. And, you know, like, I'm like, I know what it feels like to be most people in this riding, you know, and I'm a person of color and, you know, there was a lot of things that I was like, I'm just like a really normal person. And I think it's important that we have just like normal people representing us and being our voices, right? And I think, unfortunately, I think that's a trope that gets used in politics a lot, where people are like, I'm just your average Joe, vote for me because I'm like you. And I'm, you know, and I'm like, yeah, but I mean, you have millions of dollars. Like, you are not an average Joe. And I was like,
basically using that as a,
yeah, but either way though, if let's say if somebody comes from a regular, you know, and then they eventually go into that lifestyle, sooner or later, they will develop to be having, you know, they'll get paid, right?
Absolutely. But I think as long as you remain in touch with the people that you represent, you know, there's a lot of politicians. A really great example is the MPP for Ottawa Centre. Honestly, like, phenomenal guy. Every time there's, you know, a protest or something going on, you know, I'm lucky enough to have his number, but, you know, if you tweet at him or if you message him and you're like, hey, there's this going on in the community, I think it'd be important for you to show up, he'll be there. You know, he'll get on his bike and he'll jet on over. So as long as you stay connected and you stay true to that person that you were when you got elected, and And I think it's very easy in politics to let things get to your head. Because a lot of people are going to treat you like you're like top shit. And you've just got to remember that like you are, you know, you could lose your job any day. Start there, because, you know, if people don't want to vote for you, then you're gone. And your paycheck's gone. But also you are there to be the voice of somebody else. You being you is not that important. It's about having, you know, a lot of MP and MPP's offices have, I don't think it's called community care, but I'll just use community care for right now. But essentially they'll have a staffer in their office whose sole job is to have people come in and voice concerns or ask for help. Or, you know, hey, I'm having a really hard time with this. Can you help me find the correct resources, or, you know, direct me in the right direction? And there's a lot of offices that don't do that anymore, or that don't prioritize that, and they prioritize their work in Parliament or at Queen's Park. And inherently, I think it's more important to have that community care, because, again, it's not about what you as the politician want to push in terms of policies. It's about representing the people who elected you. So if somebody's like, hey, I think this is really messed up, it's like, okay, well, how do we take that and like, how do we bring that to Parliament? And if enough people complain about that or talk about that and say, hey, this is a really big issue, how do we get that pushed across, you know? And to a certain extent, it does become hyper local, because, you know, hey, in my neighborhood, like, you know, this is a problem. How do we push this forward? And that's something that I find is like often forgotten about in politics. You lose a lot of that like human side, you know? It becomes about ideologies. It becomes about like
appearance,
exactly. So honestly, that's mainly why I ran, because I was like, I just think it's important to like try to go back to that. And the riding I ran in was like where I grew up.
What do you mean you ran?
So I was there was a provincial by-election. So I was the NDP candidate.
Really?
So I ran in the election. Yeah.
Oh, like so somebody could vote for you in their riding. No
they
way.
Sure could.
Wow.
They sure could.
Oh,
5,000 people voted for me. And I'm like, I only knew like 100 of those people. Yeah, it was
incredible.
Honestly kind of wild to like drive in your own neighborhood. Like that's where like
how long ago
grew
was
up. The election was February 27th, 2020.
Okay.
Yeah. So not feels like a, I don't know.
Almost
Feels like
3 years.
yeah, it's not that long ago, but you know, the pandemic was like took up the time afterwards. So it feels like it wasn't that long ago, but yeah, it's super wild to drive in like a place you know, I'm like, this is like my cousin lives there, and like, you know, I used to go to the store when I was a kid, and it's just very weird to see like people that you don't know who have a sign outside of their house that has your name on it, and you're like, ooh, that's
really
weird.
cool.
Yeah.
I've kind of developed a bit more of a political identity / opinion in the more I'd say the last year, and even though I'm not even 100% there, because I don't really know that much.
That's fair.
But
You're
I guess
always
the way that I see politics is basically like there's a fire, and people are just dancing around this fire.
Okay.
You know, and the fire being the truth, and nobody's putting water to put the fire out. And so my question is there actually such a thing as truth in politics? Because especially with what's going on right now, I just see a bunch of lies, and I think politicians are either like stupid, or they're just they don't understand that people are actually like, you know, awake to a certain extent. Like, we know that you're bullshitting.
Okay, I get that. I will say I think it's a little bit more complex than that, because inherently, no matter who the politician is, no matter who the party is, everybody has morals and values that they're trying to abide by, right? I think I'll stay away from talking too much about what's happening now, because I think the world currently is very polarized, and I think the pandemic really added to that in terms of like there was a lot of time for people to be at home, to be
Down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, and like lack of
everything.
you know lack of like we've missed a lot of like interactions.
And direct information and conversation and more thorough. Yeah,
Correct.
You're getting a very like kind of small.
Yeah, and like I find on the internet it's very easy to kind of get trapped in this little bubble of like people who only have the same opinions as you do, you know? So like I'll give you an example, Twitter.
Twitter, I was just about to say.
My Twitter is, obviously I have a lot of people that I agree with that I follow, but then I also follow a lot of people I don't agree with because I'm like, I don't want to be in this little like stratosphere of where I hear only what I want to hear.
Sides.
You know?
Yeah, I do the same thing.
I think a big problem right now is that like everybody thinks they're an expert, which is a little bit of a problem.
Yeah.
Because no one's an expert in everything. You're an expert in something, but I think the internet is a double-edged sword. It's one of those things where like it gave people lots of information, but sometimes it doesn't give you the context around that information. So it's kind of like
it gives you the ability to easily dismiss it without actually like, going into it. Yeah.
And to find the things that you want to find. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And also, people are lazy.
People are absolutely lazy.
They'll read something and then that's what it is.
And especially when algorithms are sort of adapting to what you're looking at, it's like if you're not
catered
like
to
you said, actually
like
feed
Facebook
out of that.
showcasing negative feed, and in order for you to get that anger. I don't know if you heard about this, but this was something that was just revealed not too long ago.
And I think something that scares me a little bit about social media is I think people look at social media and are like, this is factual. And I'm like, your Uncle Bob telling me about this is not news. Like that is not factual. So I think it's like, you know, understanding like how I've got lots of friends who are journalists and like understanding how that process actually works and like fact checking things, you know, and how they get information. Like I can share information with them, but I know that they're not going to share that information until they know that it is factually correct. Even though they know me and they know that I wouldn't be making it up, they'll still fact check it because it's part of their job, right?
That's integrity, really, at the end of the day.
Correct.
And it's just understanding all the sides.
But then we also have the issue of media, right? BC is, you know, has heavy funding.
I mean, yes, but the CBC was also funded. In the Harper years, the CBC was not defunded; it was also being funded. So I think, don't get me wrong, I think that there's
which could be a bit of bias, like
just
you don't
like any
see
human beings, right? Because like a corporation is always going to be made up of human beings. So I think human beings have biases. So you're inherently going to have a little bit of like you'll have a leaning, let's say, more so than a bias. But I think that news agencies particularly are very good at understanding that and being like, how do we beat that bias? You know, like you'll see a lot of panels where like they'll go out of their way to be like, hey, here's a conservative view and here's a liberal view and here's an NDP view and here's to counteract those inherent biases. And like you see it often with how, you know, politicians are interviewed, because, you know, even if the CBC is interviewing a liberal, they will often still be very grilling and be like, no, answer the question. Like you know, so inherently, yes, humans have biases. So there's always going to be bias in the world. There's always going to be a little bit of leaning. I just think it's a matter of how the fact that you acknowledge that and then that you go, how do we counter that? You know, because like if I'm speaking to you guys, like I'm like, I know what my biases are. You know what I mean? Every time I talk about politics with my friends, particularly around election time, I'm like, hey, make sure, you know, you go vote. And if somebody's like, I don't really know who to go vote for, I'm like, okay, well, you know, I will acknowledge that this is what my bias is, but here's like I can give you correct resources to find out about all the platforms of all the candidates, you know? And I'm maybe not going to tell you, like, I might tell you who I'm going to vote for, but I'm going to be like, that doesn't mean anything, and I'm not going to tell you who I'm not voting for. You know, I'm not going to be like, don't vote for this person. So it's a matter of how you, sorry, my dog is in the background barking.
That's okay. Come here, buddy.
It's a matter of how you counteract your own biases, right? And like, I think that approach reflects in life also, where like, you know, you understand what your privileges are in life, and you kind of like counteract, or you recognize things in your life that you're like, oh, like I do this, so maybe I'm going to actively try to, you know, I can't remove my biases, right? But I can be like, how do I actively, awareness is great
incorporate
to start.
Other ideas and incorporate other viewpoints.
Yeah, and like offset it a little bit, you know?
What do you tell someone though then, you know, to like in terms of voting for someone, you know, because basically the way I see it is come election time, people are, they're selling you something. They're selling you a story. We're going to do this, and these are the policy changes that we're going to make, and we're going to do all this stuff. And then when it comes time, and they get elected, and then they're in, power, they become liars because they don't follow to their words. So, I mean,
I will start off with saying though that like
it's harder than it seems.
It is very hard to enact policy, and it is very, very dependent on what the government is made of, right? Like what everybody else is, because like
there's a lot of layers to it
and there's
too,
like we
right?
don't have we haven't had a majority party in a little bit of time, and like don't get me started on that, because I think that there should never be a majority of anyone, because I think that inherently for the best of Canadians, minority governments are better, because I think it forces parties to work together, which is good for Canadians, right? It's more equitable, it's more representative.
Yeah, the more debating dynamic, but like that, which leads to better results at the end.
Exactly.
That are more balanced, I should say.
Exactly. But I think at the end of I'll bring this back to like, it's about people, because at the end of the day, like when you go vote, and this is probably the best advice I give to people when around election time, is remember that yes, you are voting for a party, but inherently you are voting for the person who's going to represent you. So again, like bring it back to like hyper local and be like, who are my representatives? Who do, like, out of the options I have in my own riding, because we're not the US, you're not voting for the prime minister, right? Unless
a lot of people like don't understand that.
Yeah, exactly. Like, unless you live in the riding of somebody who is a leader, you're not voting for the prime minister, right? You're voting for a person who's going to represent you, who's going to be one of many people who are there. So I always think about it as like, I think I've made it very clear that my bias is obvious, and it's like, it makes it easy to know, like when I have an election in my own riding, it's like, I will obviously have a preference towards one particular party, but I will still look at all the candidates. And I'll go to like candidate meet and greets, and I'll go to debates, because I want to hear more from the person who's going to represent me.
It's cool that you go back to that. I was going to bring that point up. I think it's really interesting that you brought that up, because of the fact that, like you said, and obviously the pandemic did have an effect on this, but like the integration of face-to-face, of like word of mouth, of actual discussion, with these people, and understanding kind of like the levels to it, because it is a trickle-down effect, right? You have like the people at the top, and then but like you said, you have your local ridings and things. It's like, it's good to really know everyone personally, because then you actually get your own like true representation. You're not just getting like a social media post idea of who this person is and what they do. It's like, oh, they may represent many things, and that's just one aspect of a greater picture. So pandemic made it very hard for us to do a lot more of that, but I think it's important to still get like people talking to each other. They're definitely
coming back though. Like it's
agreed.
It's like, and even when they were like Zoom kind of conversations, like it's still nice to be, and I know that
face-to-face.
Exactly, and I know that people don't necessarily like, they're like, oh, like I'm gonna go vote, and that will be it. But people don't really think of like, where are these candidates? Like, are they gonna, if they knock on your door, like chat with them, ask them your questions. When I knock on doors, whether it be for myself or for other people, one of the first questions I ask is not actually, I don't typically start off with like, hi, my name is blah, 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 and I'm here for blah, 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 and here's the policy changes you want, we're doing. Because at the end of the day, policy is like really high level. So generally what I start off with is like, hi, my name is Myriam, and, I'm here for this party. What are some issues that like you care about that are happening right now, and then we kind of go off on a conversation based on that, and then I could talk about policies that are related to that. You know what I mean? I could be like, hey, like, oh, so you're really upset about healthcare. Okay, let's have a conversation about healthcare. And like, here is what my party wants to do about that. But you're having it's a much more genuine conversation to be like, what are issues you care about, and how do they affect you in reality, and how do we take these big picture policies and bring them into concrete actions, right?
And without maybe being like too direct about what your bias are. It's
Correct.
like you can use your bias to maybe adapt to what they're talking about. Correct. Or what issue they're bringing up.
Correct.
Like, and almost see how you guys can formulate something together.
Absolutely.
Like,
and even when people disagree with you, I think there's still sometimes most times there's still like room for a conversation, you know, like,
and knowledge to be gained.
Exactly. Like I knocked on a door of this one gentleman once and he was like, well, you know, like I think there's too much immigration. And I was like, okay, well, why do you think that? You know, and like, what's your, you know, how do you, what's your bias against immigrants? Like what's the root of it? And sometimes people are like, oh, I don't want to talk to you, but I'm not going to vote for you anyways. And they close the door on you. And like, well, you tried. And sometimes people will genuinely have a conversation with you, and then you can try to find out, you know, if there is a middle ground where you can meet. Sometimes there isn't, you know, and they're like, no, I just hate immigrants. And I'm like,
yeah.
Well, the reason I'm here is because like one of my parents was an immigrant. But okay, see ya.
Yeah, cool.
You know, but sometimes you can have genuine conversations, and I think it's just about like continuing to try to have those conversations. And yeah, and again, like really engaging with, because it's the people who run in elections in your riding, whether it be municipal, federal, or provincial, have a lot more time to talk to you than the leader of the party. You know what I mean? So like, you want to ask a question to Justin Trudeau, it is a lot harder to pin him down than to pin down your local representative. And at the end of the day, whether one party leader becomes the prime minister or not, at the end of the day, that person who gets elected is the person who's going to represent you, right? They're part of a bigger party, sure, but they are your representative. So I think we should just start thinking about it more locally like that, where, you know, it's about people and it's about, you know, the vibe that you get from the person who is going to be representing you, because inherently that's the person you're going to go knock on their door and go to their office if you have an issue. You know what I mean? If you're like, hey, I want to complain about something, you're not knocking on the door of the prime minister. You're knocking on the door of your local representative. So typically that's what I tell people. I'm like, try to get more involved in your local politics and start thinking about it smaller and then bigger, versus go bigger and then be like, well, I don't really care about how it pins down at the bottom, because the bottom and the smaller stuff effect, is right? Really, exactly. Like people think federal politics are the most important. No, they're not. It goes in order of importance. It goes municipal, it goes provincial, and then it goes federal, because inherently municipal affects your life the most, then provincial, then federal. You know what I mean? Like our foreign policies are not impacting our lives as much as our healthcare policies, which are provincial. And our healthcare policies are not impacting our life as much as the snow clearing programs, which is municipal. So it's a matter, and I think people often get around to like, you're like, oh, no, but like, who's the prime minister of the country? And it's like, who's your mayor? Who's your councillor?
Yeah.
Then who's your MPP? Then who's your MP? Then who's your prime minister? Because that is actually who impacts, unless you're like a super, super politically involved person and, you know, you're part of these conversations. If you're a regular person, that's actually the order of how it impacts your life.
It's like the one way you could have an effect. And if you actually like put the effort in, maybe collectively with other people too, it's like,
correct. Yeah.
Going on healthcare, I mean, I read something not too long ago that there's a possibility of privatization of healthcare. I haven't read too much about it. Maybe you might be more informed. Do you care to? Do you know anything about that, or? Well,
I mean,
is it a bill that they're trying to pass?
No. It's a very slow push towards. And look, I'm not an expert on conservative healthcare policies, so I will preface it with that. I'll give you the gist of what I know, but it is not all like factually correct. But inherently, it's a move towards privatization. Sorry,
privatization.
This is like the French first coming out.
You speak French?
Yeah, it's my first language.
Ok, tu parles français?
Ben oui.
Ouais. Interesting.
Ben oui, je viens d'Ottawa, je veux dire. C'est comme une des villes les plus bilingues du Canada.
Exactly.
So inherently, by cutting down health services and by, you know, doing little things like, oh, well, you know, there's a surgery backlog, instead of hiring more medical staff, or instead of like paying them better wages or giving them better work conditions, we're going to be like, well, there is a backlog. So you know how we're going to fix that backlog? We're going to hire a private company to do certain types of surgeries. And then eventually it then moves to like, oh, well, if you want to get these types of surgeries, you got to pay for them. Or if you want to get them faster, you pay for them. And then you become a two-tiered system where there's a public health system that is collapsing, that doesn't pay their staff as well. So the staff is not great.
Yeah.
Because all the great stuff is now going to the private
Basically
sector.
creating that divide.
Right? So essentially, they're not privatizing healthcare per se, but they're inherently creating a two-tiered system. Like we're moving towards a two-tiered system where if you have money, we won't lose healthcare if you don't have the money, but you will have access to lesser healthcare if you don't have the money. And inherently, one of the great joys of Canadian healthcare is that no matter how much money you have, you should all be getting the same kind of
access
care,
to.
right? So that's why people are not loving what's happening right now.
And I feel like that could create a lot of resentment between people too, even though it's kind of like forced resentment, you know? It's like some people like, you know, would maybe be more upset towards someone who is financially available, but it's like they're not necessarily a bad person for using their money to get healthcare. Like some people might
if the
be
system
like happy
exists,
they're taking advantage of it.
You know,
but,
you're going to use it, but the problem is the system shouldn't exist.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. That's a good point.
Because it alienates. Thank you. It alienates people, and it creates that a larger economic gap than there already is. Right.
So instead of maybe allocating assets into, you know, funding, you know, the actual problem initially, right? I think that seems like a fair solution.
Correct. And Ontario gets quite a large share of healthcare funds from the federal. And something that is currently in the news and a big argument is the provinces want more money. And the federal government is saying, we will give you more money, but we want to tell you where it's going to go. And the provinces are like, no, that's our jurisdiction. And currently, Ontario is sitting on lots of extra funds that was received during COVID that has not been spent. So the federal government's kind of like, no, I mean, if your system is failing and you're not spending the money, we're not going to give you extra money if you're not going to tell us where it's going to go. So it's essentially like, to me, it kind of feels like a teenager being like, I want money. And the parents are like, but you have money in your piggy bank. And they're like, don't ask, just give me money. And it's like, no, but like, I'm giving you the money. I should be somehow allowed to like have a general idea of where it's going, right?
I've been noticing too, especially like going back to Twitter, like and this is just
Twitter.
like
Twitter
things
is
that I've been observing, not
place.
necessarily that I believe.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people like trying to look at both sides and understanding both sides and having an open mind. But you can see sometimes people are like, oh, I think some people feel like their opinions aren't getting heard. Yeah. And either can even be related to, you know, people are like complaining. You're just like, oh, you know, what's going on right now is almost like a small version of like dictatorship and stuff like that. So
I would definitely not go as far as saying that, mainly because when I lived in Egypt, it was a quote unquote democracy, but I mean, there was only one name on the ballot.
Yeah.
And if you put your name forward, you were either one of my friend's uncles tried to run for president in Egypt, and he ended up in jail. No reasoning behind it. Nothing said to his family. He's never getting out of jail. They were not even sure if he's alive. So I think that is something that I have, and it goes back to the traveling and living abroad.
I'm not saying I believe
right?
that. I'm not saying I believe that. I'm just saying I see people are commenting. They're making those comments on Twitter.
I see that too. But my problem with that is I'm like,
dude, you don't know what actual dictatorship looks like.
You don't know what actual dictatorship looks like. And I'm like, see, this is why everybody should travel and live in different places, because you get to see that, like, you know, don't get me wrong, our country and our democracy is not perfect. It is not perfect. We should never think it's perfect, because that's when you become stagnant and you don't want, and there's no progress, right? We should always be striving to do better. But the moment we start throwing around words like dictatorship, I'm like, and I'm not a big Twitter I have Twitter and I look at it, but it just gives me a lot of anxiety. So I try to stay away from it. And I also don't think it's productive to get into arguments with people on Twitter, because I'm like, we are just two people on a computer yelling at each other. I'm like, let's meet up. I will happily tell you why I don't think this is a dictatorship. So I try not to engage in like online discourse that way.
Yeah, that's probably for the better though.
Exactly. But it's definitely very sad, because, you know, I'm like, I've seen what an actual dictatorship looks like. You know, when we lived there, it was a military state. So, you know, I would walk to school, and on my walk to school, there was like 6 different armed, and I lived across the street from my school, so like it was a 2-minute walk.
Wow.
And there were 6 different spots where there were army personnel with like AK-47s, and that was just the reality of like what we lived in, right?
Wow.
So yeah, I find it really difficult to see that kind of discourse happening in Canada, because I'm like, no, you're not worried. No one's gonna kill you. Like, we have all these rights and we have all these things, and it's not perfect, but you know. But we've turned into this like weird polarizing world, and I think a big issue is that we are heavily, and this is pre-pandemic also, but we're very, very heavily influenced by American politics, and we're typically, if you look at history, we're typically about 5 years behind the U.S. in terms of like stuff bleeding from the U.S. into Canada, which kind of makes sense because about 5 years ago is when Trump got elected. So there's a lot of that, like similar sentiments that are kind of coming across the border. And
so 5 years delay.
Yeah.
What do you think that is?
It's just, I don't know. It's just a political trend. It's like, that's
Really?
about, yeah. It's, I don't quote me on this because I don't have it written anywhere, but I've read something about how, if you look throughout like
history,
it was this article and they were going through, I don't know, the past like 40, 50 years. And it was like, you had this historical trend of like political action happening in the US happening approximately 5 years later in Canada.
Interesting.
And it's hard to have the US as our neighbor because yes, we are very similar, but we also have these like very, very big, inherently different morals and values.
I was about to say,
as societies. So, you'll see people talking about stuff in Canada, like I was just saying this to a friend of mine recently about, people being like, oh, well, you can't arrest me because, you didn't read me my Miranda rights. And I'm like, there's no Miranda rights in Canada, and it's like, because a lot of people are getting their information from what's happening in the US, and it's like inherently we are not the same though, and we don't have the same, society. So our societies don't function the same. Like people will be like, oh, well, the Bill of Rights, and it's like we don't have the Bill of Rights here. It's actually like the Charter of Rights. And I know that I know it's semantics and like it's just a word, but inherently it's because they're two different documents that we are guaranteed different rights. Like you don't have the right to bear arms here.
Yeah,
that's
worded
not
differently, set up differently, like very
exactly
very different intentions behind them as well. Like.
Exactly. So it's I don't know. I think that's why we're having a lot of political turmoil in Canada is because we have this like discourse coming in from the US that's being pushed in Canada, and it's like, but this doesn't really fit here. Like I see how we can have similar sentiments, but they're not the same.
No, absolutely. Hey, buddy, you okay?
He just wants attention.
Yeah,
that's
right.
it.
He's like, why are you guys ignoring me?
Yeah, he's like, everybody's over there having a good time, and I'm not included.
We'd like to give a special shout out to our other guest, Coda over here, chilling in the background. He just wanted to make a little appearance.
Correct. He had some thoughts as well. He had some thoughts. Yeah.
And just before we wrap it up, actually, just to kind of, I guess, circle back around to the traveling aspect, like, would you say that, especially because you became involved in politics and had a really good sense of it, like, would you say a lot of that was influenced by different political systems and how you envision it? And what would you say is maybe like big ones that stand out that kind of affected your perspective on it? Like,
absolutely. Well, growing up, we watched a lot of, we always watched French elections, which I'm not 100% sure why, because like
French from France? Really?
Yeah,
Interesting.
Yeah. And something that I always loved from there was that they had proportional representation, which is something that a lot of people are actively pushing for in Canada. It has yet to happen, but I think it would be really interesting. So essentially, you've got kind of these like ranked ballots, right? So when you vote for your most favorite to least favorite, and then that gives you a certain you get a certain share of. Because essentially, if you look at Canada, let's say like a party, or Ontario. Let's give you Ontario as an example. 30% of Ontario, or 30% of Ontarians who voted. That is a whole other thing. Is voted for the Conservatives. But is that represent? And so therefore they get a majority. But inherently, 30% is not a majority. A majority should be 51%. So we are not equitably represented. So if 20% of let's say 20% voted for the NDP, well, they don't have 20% of the seats, so therefore they don't have 20% of the say, which makes it that it's not actually representative of the people who voted. So if we had a ranked ballot, kind of like they have in France, and same with their
I've heard of this actually.
Yeah. So with their president run, which is separate, it's also a ranked ballot, and then somebody gets dropped off. So it's like there's 4 people, vote between these 4. The top 2 continue on, or sorry, you continue on until somebody has 51%. So they keep dropping the lowest and then the lowest and then so inherently you end up with 51% of people at least voted for this one person. So therefore it feels more equitable.
And that's fair too, because you've also had probably a much more thorough understanding of the different dynamics between these different government bodies or whatever. Yeah,
Absolutely.
So you have a more informed decision and opinion at that point. Like you're like, oh, okay, I can choose between these 2, but it is also influenced by these other parties that have very much been active in this kind of like these decisions. Or
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
cool.
It's definitely a very cool thing that I would love to see come to Canada. It's something that there's a lot of organizations, particularly in Ottawa. There's Fair Votes, and it's something that they push forward for a lot. And I don't know if you know this, but in Ontario, a lot of schools, when there's elections or by-elections, schools will do like a mock election, particularly like grades 6, 7, 8, and they'll use it as part of their civics class. So there's a school in my riding that did it, and they invited all the candidates. Not everybody showed up. I was like, oh yes, absolutely. Like, you want me to go talk to a room of 7th graders? Done. Love that. I'm like, and I realized that like inherently I did that for nothing because they can't vote for me. So like, it's not beneficial to me, but I was like, oh, absolutely. It's important for young people to understand why it's important to vote, like why, what kind of perspectives there are within different parties. And they did a ranked ballot. So then you ended up with like a percentage, right? So very cool. I would have won that grade 7 class.
Yeah.
I won by like a large margin. I was like, God damn it. Can't wait till you can vote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it circles back around to what you said about like, I forget what I was going to relate to that, but just, I guess, like the fact that they're, sorry, give me 1 second.
No worries,
I'll cut
no
this
worries.
part out. I'm trying to remember exactly
worries.
what I was going to ask. Okay, you were saying to give it to the 7th graders. Oh, yeah. It goes back to what you were saying about the importance of representation in the first place and just having that understanding for them. Like the 7th graders, for example, it's like, well, at least they can go and see it from someone who's actually genuinely passionate, as opposed to just like a trickle-down effect of like someone kind of like being like, this is politics and and it's scary, and like, kind of giving them just like the very veiled view of it.
Absolutely.
And seeing someone, that's actually more like natural.
I think it also makes it a lot easier when they turn 18 and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, you're supposed to go vote. And it's like, okay, but I don't know who these people are. I don't know what the process looks like, right?
Or who to trust.
Exactly.
Or read,
Exactly. And it's kind of like, it's hard because most people just like look at the pamphlet you get in the mail and you're like, okay, I don't know. There's like a couple points on there. But if you look at most pamphlets, at the bottom, there's usually like a phone number or an email address. And from my experience, I will tell you, people will respond to you. I'm good, thank you. So it's always nice because people, you can actually have these conversations with the candidates that are running. And on the note of like how it's influenced me in terms of like traveling and living in different places, I think something that's really interesting to me is that, or something that I'm really passionate about per se, is just political engagement in general, because I've lived in a lot of countries where like it doesn't really matter if you vote anyways, because it is a true dictatorship, right? So I find it really, really, really difficult to see these like incredibly low turnout numbers in Canada, whether it be provincial or federal or municipal elections, because people just feel apathy towards politics. They're like, well, it's not really, my vote's not going to matter anyways. So why would I go vote?
Whereas with the different perspective of these other places, like you're saying, it's distorted because it's like, well, these people are actually actively going to try, yet they're still just going to make no difference.
That's right.
And they're almost knowingly doing it too.
That's right. Yeah, and we're just sitting here being like, and I think we treat it as like, oh yeah, we can vote. And it's like, no, but it's not just a right. Like, it's also a privilege. Like, we are privileged to be able to vote and to have a say, and to be able to, like, you know, make a point with your vote, you know, whether like, most people don't know that you can go and reject your ballot. And rejecting your ballot is a statement. And it's inherently just saying, hi, I don't like any of these candidates. And then they have to inform all of the candidates that somebody rejected their ballot. So somebody thought, I don't like any of you, and none of you had enough policies that I enjoyed. So, and that's still actively participating, even though you didn't vote for anybody, right?
I never knew that. Yeah.
So you can reject your ballot.
It does create information,
right?
Yeah.
So so that's something that I really care about in terms of, like, I think it's really important to be involved in whether or not you're like super informed. Just taking 5 or 10 minutes out of your day right before an election and being like, okay, well, let me just like look into the candidates and, you know, I don't know, maybe email all of them a couple questions or give them a call and just be like, hey, here's things that I care about. What do you want? What's your opinion on these things? Because inherently we are incredibly lucky to be able to have that right or that privilege. So yeah, it's really heartbreaking when you're like, oh man, like you know, in Ontario in the past election, I think there was like something like 42% of people voted. And you're like, that's wild. Like 42% of people, well, actually 30% of people within that 42%. So that's a really small number.
Yeah.
Got to decide who our next premier was. And a lot of people just sat at home, and it's impacting their lives. It's impacting their healthcare. It's impacting their education. You know, it's actually having an effect on their lives, and people just actively chose not to participate.
And it's not to like necessarily simplify it, but just I look at it as like having a pie, but like you've got only a quarter of it left, and you're basically trying to pick off of that as a whole, like sort of thing. And it's like, but it's really only like a quarter of the entire message or representation.
Exactly. And like that's all that people will have of that pie is like that tiny little portion. But there's a whole pie, and we just like haven't touched it for some reason, you know?
Interesting.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to people in general? Let's say they're kind of like, they want to learn more about politics. How do you go about it? What's one of a good starting point to get informed?
Okay, so I know we talked about CBC earlier, but CBC has this really, really interesting tool, and that I will say is like, I don't think it's very biased at all.
Okay.
So it's they do it typically before every election, provincial or municipal. I'm blanking on the name. The CBC Vote Compass.
Okay.
Yeah. So what they'll do is they'll take the main issues that are being discussed that particular election, right? Because every election's got like their main, like their key issues. And then it will ask you, I'll give you, I think it's like 10 to 15 questions, and it's got a statement. And it'll be like, I don't know, you think privatizing healthcare is a good idea. Strongly agree, agree, no opinion, disagree, strongly disagree. And then inherently what they do is they go through the party messaging for all the parties. And they will find where that party lies on that key issue. And then once you're done the quiz, so the little quiz gives you like, it's an array of things, right? It talks about all the different topics. So by the end, you'll get this little chart, and it positions you on a political spectrum for that election. And then it will show you a little dot of where the other parties are. So you can see, oh, well, on most issues, I actually agree with, I don't know, the Green Party, you know, and sometimes you're like, oh, that's surprising. And then you can go back through the questions, and you can go question by question and see where you align with each party per question.
Interesting.
Wow.
So I find that to be, it's
and you said that's called Vote Compass on CBC.
CBC's Vote Compass.
Honestly, that does sound like a really good tool, because it also like a lot of people I feel like have a hard time deciding or changing their ideas based on the fact that they don't know, or they don't maybe get to research it thoroughly enough to understand why a party represents them so much. So to be able to have a neutral standpoint, and then you're given like, oh, like a suggestion, like this is what you matched with. It's like, oh shit, cool. I have a little bit of a starting point.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then you can kind of go from there and like do more research. But like that's typically a good starting point, because I think a lot of people, unfortunately, base their political opinions on like, often it's family. Like, oh, my family's always voted this way. Or, like a key issue that you've heard. You know what I mean? Like a lot of people will be like, oh, well, I don't want my taxes to go up, and like the conservatives don't make your taxes go up, so I'm going to vote conservative. And it's like, yeah, okay, but that's, that's a very like general thing.
There's layers to it.
And then also every election has its key things that are going on at that time. And the messaging does change between election to election. So I find that's a really, really great tool, because, sometimes like I don't vote conservative, but sometimes there's been issues where like, I'll go through my little questions and I'm like, oh, wow, I can't believe that like I had the same answer as the conservatives. I didn't know, because I didn't read their whole platform. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know that that's what their stance was on this one key issue, and then I can go in and look at their platform and be like, oh, like, let me find out more about that one point that we agreed on. Right. So that's usually a really, really good starting point, I would say. But aside from that, the best advice I could give anybody who wants to know more or just wants to be more active is really, it's a really personal thing. Like, it's talk to people who are involved in it. Pretty much every riding has a riding association. So you'll have like, an Ottawa South, like, NDP riding association, and a liberal riding association, and a conservative riding association, and like you might have a PPC one, to reach out to find those riding associations and check out their websites, and because that's between elections, because they might not necessarily have a candidate, to reach out to those associations. But then when it's around an election and there is actual people who are running, to reach out to those people, because again, like when I ran, mostly what I did, honestly, it was knock on people's doors. I spent about 3 months knocking on about 80,000 doors.
Sometimes it's really about just making an appearance.
Yeah, just talk to people. Like, I talked to this one guy who had a PPC sign outside of his house, and somebody on my team was like, oh, don't bother knocking. Like, clearly you guys aren't going to agree. And I was like, well, I'm down for a challenge. Like, let's have a chat. Let's see it. If he yells at me and closes his door on me, then like, no. Whatever, I'll
no harm, no foul. You try.
Yeah, I'm like, I'll go get a cookie after, and like I'll feel better about it. It's fine. But I knocked on it, and like we started chatting, and we had a really great chat. We talked about healthcare because his daughter was a nurse, and we got around to, like, I spent a solid like 20 minutes outside chatting with this guy. And then by the end of it, he was like, you know what, I really like you. He's like, I'll vote for you. He's like, I'll take a sign. And right on. We are super far on the political spectrum from each other. But
as human beings,
right? We got along, and he was like, yeah, I'd vote for you. I'd be down for you to represent me. So sure.
You seem,
politics really is just an aspect of humanity, right? Like,
correct.
You seem to have a lot of knowledge, and it seems like you're pretty well educated in this realm. Do you think you'll ever actively join some type of political engagement ever again? Probably.
Yeah. The door is not closed. I haven't walked through the door yet. It has to be the right moment. When I ran in 2020, it was like a lot of good timing. Between then and now, all the other elections have just like been not great timing for me personally in my life. So it's just a matter of timing, but it's something that I'm still super passionate about. So I'm very much going to do it again at some point, and I'm happy. I'm still involved on the riding association, and nice. I'm during the other elections. I got involved as much as I could. I knocked on doors with people, and I don't knock on doors for a candidate because they're from my party. I meet the candidate first, and then if I believe in that person, I will happily go and I'll haul my butt in the winter and start, knocking on doors. And if I believe in you as a person, like, it's easy for me to talk you up at a door because I believe in you. And I'm like, oh, I think you should, you should represent me. So I'm going to tell people why you should represent me. So definitely something I will do again for sure.
Some final words, I guess you could say food for thought. What would be your advice in general if people who are listening?
Just for life.
Ooh, about life.
Leaning on the more positive side of life.
Oh, that's always the side I'm on. So
Nice.
no worries there. I think amidst the past couple of years, they've been difficult years for most people in some way, shape, or form for most people. But I think inherently if we can continue to move through the world with grace and empathy and kindness, and, just, this sounds super cheesy, and I didn't mean for it to sound cheesy, but really treat people how you want to be treated, and you will be surrounded with it's easier to find the good and to see the good and the positivity in life when you shine it out, you know what I mean? And when you actively try to be a kind person and go little things, the other day I was driving past somebody and they had their hood up and I was in a rush and I had somewhere to go and I drove past them, and as I was driving past them I was like, oh, I should have stopped. I have a booster, a little boosting cable or battery, but then I also have booster cables, and I'm like, that's probably what they need. And I'm like, oh man, and I've been in that situation and it sucks. And I got to the next light and I was waiting in the red light and I'm like, God. No, I have to go back. Did a U-turn, came back, and the guy was so nice, and he was like, yeah, I've been waiting here for a solid half hour. He's like, no one has stopped. And I was like, yeah, this is just my little reminder of even if you think it's taking a minute out of your life, or you're gonna feel good about it, and you're going to bring more positivity in the world. Just be kind. Act with kindness in everything that you do in life.
And that small kind interjection helped him get along with his day.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's important. It's gonna change. It's gonna. You're bringing light to somebody else's day, but you're gonna feel great about yourself also afterwards.
Absolutely.
So yeah, just walk around with kindness in the world and empathy and care for others, and it makes everything a lot easier. It makes understanding people easier. It makes relationships, it makes communication, it makes work, it makes everything easier to just walk around with kindness and empathy in the world. Yeah.
Myriam, thank you so much for joining us on our podcast today.
Seriously.
Yes, guys.
I learned a lot too, honestly. You're very well spoken and articulate, and I like that because I was picking up a lot of information that I actually
always
it
happy
made
to
me think
chat.
deep. And actually, just before we go, one more shout out to our sponsor, Kayo-Tea.
Kayo-Tea.
Mr. Kayo-Tea. I just wanted to offer you basically one of the two. He graciously gave us some little bags to give to guests. Would you like either banana mint or ginger mint?
I think ginger mint.
Ginger mint?
I love ginger.
It's one of the best.
There we go.
I'm going to pass that over to you.
Thank you.
Sorry, we're a little fire-based on the table here.
It looks
Hope you enjoy.
so good. I'm going to try it when I get home.
Yeah. But honestly, thank you so much. It's genuinely been a great time.
Thanks, guys.
It's just nice to chat and hear your stories. And I would love to have you back sometime again in the future when we get there.
100%.
Absolutely. I would love that. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
See you, Mary.